Seidler will provide from the Sociology Department from the Berkshire University in London. And we will also have Dr. Gloria Carriaga adding her comments from UNAM, and Professor Beno de Kaiser from the Veracruz University, who is currently doing a study in UNAM. And he is working on the workshop of a workshop for men. So thank you very much to you all for joining today. We have the keynote from Professor Seidler now, and this is in the framework of the Facilitator Diploma of Comprehensive Work for Men, where we are aiming to find members of academia and the administrative staff that are capable of implementing action with men for the prevention and attention of violence. Likewise, for the promotion and equality of safeguarding or creating a safe environment in universities. Thank you very much for joining today's call, and I am sure that we will enjoy this session. Thank you very much, and now the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Sandra, for opening the floor for this Wednesdays for Equality that we have been organizing since last year. We really appreciate this space. It is very important for us to be here to talk about masculinities, because at the end of the day, equality needs to be constructed from a gender perspective with men. I would like to emphasize the appreciation for Dr. Victor Seidler. I know that he's been in Mexico several times. And Gloria Carriaga, thank you very much for being here today as a commenter. We would like to also thank and appreciate the effort of the team that is organizing this session, from the gender session, and finally to our simultaneous interpreters who will be translating Victor's words into Spanish and vice versa. So as of 8th and 9th of March of 2020, the growing question is, and what about men? When are men going to do something? So the growing violence against women and gross inequalities in our society have been normalized in the context of historic patriarchy. However, this patriarchy is embodied in many ways in us, men, even though we might not want to see that. That is why we have been building, as of last year, something that we call the Comprehensive Work with Men. And this is part of the action that is after the inter-university meeting of universities that we had in April and May. We are currently creating this diploma for facilitators to work with men as part of this program. We have been able to call on almost 60 men in UNAM that are here, 4 from the Veracruz University, that are willing to train and to work, to do the work, and also train other men so that this university can come back to being a community. So welcome to all of those who are joining, and thank you for all those listening from the YouTube channel and on Facebook live broadcast. I will follow the presentation of Dr. Gloria Carriaga, and she will introduce Victor. Gloria studied in ITESO and the Social Psychology Masters in UNAM. She is the co-founder of the University Program of Gender Studies, very well-known PUEG, where she was an academic secretary from 1992 to 2004, and she coordinated the study area of sexualities from 2004 to 2017. She is currently a teacher in the psychology school in UNAM, of which she is part as of 1999. She is part of the feminist movement and the LGBTI movement in the national, domestic, and international arenas. She was also General Secretary of EIGA from 2008 to 2014, as well as the Sexuality Program in HIV and Human Rights Protection from 2019 to 2020. Her areas of interest have been focused in human rights and sexuality. She has coordinated 11 anthologies and several chapters of books. She has developed studies in Israel, in the National University of Costa Rica, and the SPW of Brazil. She was awarded the Omecihuatl Award of Women in Mexico and the Erbelina Galindo Award of the National Human Rights Commission of Mexico for her work on human rights. And I would like to add that she has been a very close and critical companion of this program of Men Towards Equality in Mexico and Latin America. Gloria, now the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you so much for this invitation. I am very, very happy for being part of this event. Likewise, for having the opportunity of introducing Dr. Seidler. And he is an old friend from the PUG times. We have been working together for so many years, and it is such a pleasure to share this moment with him. Dr. Gloria, could you turn on your camera, please? That's great. Thank you very much. Victor Seidler is an emeritus professor from the Sociology Department in Goldsmiths University in London. His interests in investigation are social theory, philosophy, Marxism, and critical theory, moral theory, masculinities, and sexual politics. Victor has written about ethics, gender, and social politics, specifically the relationship between men and masculinities. Likewise, he was a professor on several seminars of theoretical approaches and methodological approaches on masculinities, on the framework of gender studies in the period of 1999 to 2000. He is the author of books like The Masculinity and Intimate Lives. Thank you very much, Victor Seidler, for being here. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's wonderful to be amongst friends. And I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes. And I've got some notes that I want to talk to, but I don't necessarily want to read a paper because I don't think it works well on Zoom. Zoom has opened the possibilities of a conversation across space and across time. So even though I'm not in Mexico in some ways, I thank Sandra and I thank Gloria and I thank Beno for this very kind invitation to be involved in the beginning of what will be a kind of global experiment of working with men in order for those men to then work with other men around questions and issues of gender violence. This is a new initiative, and I think it's an initiative that's going to have an impact across the world. It's not surprising that it emerges in Mexico, because Mexico, since the 60s, has been a key space in which a number of academics and researchers found refuge in Mexico City from the dictatorial regimes in other parts of Latin America. So Mexico, and particularly UNAM, has a very special place, is a very special place for such an experiment. But it's also happening in a time of crisis, a COVID crisis, which is emerging at the same time as a global climate crisis. And it seems to be, within Mexico, a feature of a gender crisis because of the violence, brutal violence against women that has been going on and getting worse in terms of the realities of everyday sexual violence and femicide. So we're talking in the middle of a political moment. And I've learned so much from conversations that I've had about how to think about this moment. So rather than me giving a lecture with any sense of authority, I feel I'm part of a conversation with colleagues in the middle of a moment of crisis in which to support the students and the feminist students, and to raise questions about the way in which men and young men can support those feminist activities. So I'm going to do this in different places. So I'm first thinking about, and this is the way of introducing thinking in a time of crisis. What does it mean to think in a time of crisis? And how do we have to acknowledge how we are differently positioned? I'm outside the crisis, the everyday crisis in Mexico, but I'm a friend, a dear friend of all those that have been working so long to develop critical studies in relationship to men and masculinities, which has been such a significant move in Mexico that has been a leading place for the whole of Latin America. So I want to frame a conversation across different spaces, which is also a conversation across different generations. So I first apologize for not speaking in Spanish. That's a great loss. And it means that my voice isn't being heard, but it's being heard through interpretation. So I want to thank the interpreters for their labors in order to make this event possible. And it's also an event that's been made possible by this Zoom technology that means we can communicate across time and across space. But in a moment of gender emergency, I want to think about the experience of working with men and masculinities since the 1970s and how to think across different generations. Benno introduced me to one of the demands that was making the movement in Mexico difficult to negotiate with professors and administrators. I'm going to say this in English, but I hope it resonates in Spanish for everybody. They don't understand that they don't understand. Just take that in for a moment. They don't understand, talking about the professors and administrators who've been challenged to do something about sexual violence. They don't understand that they don't understand. What does it mean to think across generations, and how do we learn to listen to each other? It's hard to negotiate across generations without an awareness of the intellectual, cultural, and historical events that have shaped an intellectual generation. Those people challenged for not being able to understand that they don't understand, academics and researchers, have themselves been trained at a particular moment in the 1980s and 1990s. And they've shared a certain kind of relationship to feminism, but at many levels, they haven't really engaged critically with their own inherited intellectual traditions and the way in which those traditions are themselves reinforced or express particular notions of masculinities. So how do we begin to talk across those differences of generation? And why was it so hard for those educated into a particular kind of Marxist intellectual tradition to really engage with the challenges of feminism? Firstly, one of the things that's come out is the way in which gender has still largely been framed as an issue to do with women. And men's support of feminism has been framed in terms of supporting women within the market to achieve the possibilities of equal employment, and then movements of promotion within institutions. So there was a way in which also in Britain, in the 1980s and 1990s, in the turn of feminism towards a kind of post-structuralist theory, in which theoretical feminism was in some way regarded as itself political, feminism as a political movement was much weaker, and women assumed that gender equality was already being lived in their lives and relationships. And feminism for a while was consigned to the experience of an older generation that somehow didn't speak in the same way to a younger generation that had been brought up by feminist teachers within a culture of gender equality. This changed in 2008 in Europe with the emergence of a younger generation of feminist activists who were wanting to create a conversation with political and sexual radicals who'd worked in the 1970s and wanted to open up a conversation across generations. This involved a kind of challenge or questioning of the shift that had taken place in the 1980s from Marx to Foucault, and through Foucault to Nietzsche. And there was a tacit reassertion of the claim that injustice and oppression and suffering to be real had to take place within the public sphere. There was a focus on governmentality through discursive practices, and it was assumed through Foucault's work that masculinities like femininities were constituted through discursive practices. Many of the professors who don't understand that they don't understand were partly educated through these intellectual traditions of that time in the 80s and 90s. What was helpful is that Foucault helped to bring masculinities into the theoretical realm, but at the cost of being able to really engage with the workings of gender relations of power and violence. In his later work, Foucault discovered that he could not create any bridge between his reflections on knowledge and power that treated ethics as yet another discursive practice, and his own frustrations at the limits of his early work in a history of sexuality. He didn't want that volume to be republished, and he wanted to make a break in his own writing and work, even though I imagine in the universities, A History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is still shaping people's theoretical reflections on gender and sexuality. Foucault, through his engagement with his own gay sexuality, wanted to be more personally truthful and honest, both in his relationship to himself and to others. But he could find no bridge. And because he could find no bridge, he helps us understand why those who are not able to understand that they don't understand have been caught within certain theoretical traditions that don't really appreciate the challenges of the notion that the personal is political and that people have to engage with their own lived experience in the context of structural relations of power, both of class, of gender, and of race. Unless we find a way of deep listening, we cannot be honest in our relationships with ourselves and with others. This was a critical insight of early 70s feminism, and it was part of the meaning given to the notion that the personal is political. But how can we regain honesty in our relationships with ourselves or with others if we've never learned how to be honest with ourselves? How we've thought about our gender as performative, as the way, partly through Butler's work, we've learned to perform our identities in relationship to others. As identities become performative, notions of inner life or self-reflection become lost. The personal as a source of knowledge becomes devalued, as subjective, as anecdotal, and as a reflection of a essentialist or humanist tradition. Foucault was trying to break with these legacies for himself in order to engage with his own gay sexuality and question traditions of secular rationalism. At some level, Foucault was trying to discover in his later work on ethics and subjectivity some of the earlier insights of a 1970s generation that focused upon truth-telling as an ethical practice within consciousness raising. This was to think subversively across the boundaries of the personal and the political. It was to honor the personal voice and appreciate the emotional and political work that people needed to do as ethical humans if they were to find their own voice. I'm saying this at the opening of a really important initiative, an integral initiative of working with men and masculinities. And I'm saying this because men can have a commitment to feminism and see gender still as largely an issue for women, where their support for feminism is framed as a rational political commitment to feminism and to the ending of violence against women. But they have no sense often, as a younger generation, of what it might mean to work on themselves. And the importance of a course in Mexico or anywhere of engaging men in practices of consciousness raising, which mean that they have a real risk-taking in relationship to the ways in which they were brought up into particular Mexican masculinities, often through secularized Catholic traditions that have shaped men's relationship to their bodies, to their emotions, and to their intimate lives. So often men take an instrumental relationship to their bodies and their understanding of themselves, and they don't really have much understanding across generations of what it might mean to engage seriously in a practice of consciousness raising. I'm saying this because in the movements in the 1970s in Achilles' heel that I was involved in, as men, we were threatened, brought into uncertainty by the refusal of women to interpret our emotional experience for us. Women resigned, even in their relationships with men, and insisted that it was up for men to do their own work on themselves and not rely upon their relationships with women to make them understand what they don't understand. And what they don't understand is themselves in the context, in the political and structural contexts and histories with which they've been brought up to take for granted. Women withdrew and men felt threatened. Men felt that they were the independent and autonomous sex, and that women were dependent. But actually the withdrawal of emotional labor, this is well framed in terms of Miller's work, in terms of the psychology of women, which was a very important text in the early 80s and a significant influence on Carol Gilligan's work, was to show that how men were dependent to women in their relationships, and they were deeply dependent on women to interpret male experience so that men could begin to understand what they couldn't understand. So when women withdraw, men went into a kind of crisis mode. Some said, well, but we're feminists. We want to be included. And they said, no, you can only be included if you do that work, that serious emotional and intellectual work on yourselves. You can help us by organizing creches, and you can help by doing childcare. But the most helpful thing you could do would be to engage in a realization that feminism challenges quite deeply structures of men and masculinity. And unless men were prepared to do that emotional work, there was no way in which they could expect to take part within the feminist movement as supporters. So there were different ways. In Britain, there was a resistance to talk about men as feminists. This was something that came out of the United States, where men called themselves feminists. In Britain, people refused that because they thought it was too easy for men to identify as feminists through simply wearing a T-shirt, so that you could get an imperialist prime minister like Tony Blair, who was part of the war in Iraq, wearing a T-shirt saying, "This is what a feminist looks like." Just take that on. This is what a feminist looked like. This male warrior who had taken with George Bush into actions that we are living through the consequences of in these days in Kabul airport over a period of 20 years. So these histories and these cycles are really important to think about and engage. Another of the male responses was to say, but I have no problems in my relationships with women. So I don't need to be in a men's group or a men's consciousness raising group. But the framing was, that men's controlling behavior, which could lead to violence in relationships, were exacerbated by men's ignorance of their own emotional beings. And in that context, it was relatively small numbers of men who got together in consciousness-raising groups through the 70s and the 80s and continuing to today. But there was an awareness or a commitment to feminism that was largely framed in intellectual terms as a political commitment. But the practice of consciousness raising, it would be wonderful to see around Mexico a network of consciousness raising groups which engaged with exactly this kind of work that men need to do. But there are two provisos which are really important. The first one is that gender theory has often been framed as to do with norms, gender norms. And the psychologists and the sociologists have tended to work within a tradition of secular rationalism. And they've tended to treat religious traditions as in some way part of the past that they left behind as they became students. But these religious traditions are often formative. So I shape something called a formative sociology. It's a formative psychosocial sociology, which refuses to separate psychology from sociology or politics, and which sees these in relationship. So that framing of a understanding, of an understanding, means recognizing how significant formative experiences are. But often Catholicism as a formative experience has not been dealt with in universities. It's been regarded as a private matter. But the way in which it shapes particular masculinities and femininities has been of an importance in shaping men's relationship to women and the identification of women as in some way evil, bringing evil into the world. So often men at an unconscious level have deep senses of hatred towards women that show themselves in a kind of contradictory relationship to religious traditions that they were brought up in. And the violence that they've often witnessed within their own homes and communities. Now, a few days ago, Benno shared with me an experience from his own university where older academics, researchers, professors who don't understand that they don't understand were asked about how or what their experience or how you should relate to women. And they said, this was one quote, Benno could do it better in Spanish than I can, something about you don't touch a woman with anything but with even a rose petal. Then they were asked, well, was that your experience? And then a number of them, almost a majority, said no. Our experience was of violence and abuse within the home. And that violence, that witnessing of violence, traumatic on childhood, can have enormous impact on later life and development and relationships on women. There's a very interesting Canadian psychologist, clinical psychologist, doctor, called Gabor Mate, who's worked a lot in Canada with drug addiction, with men and with women. But what has been really striking in his work is the recognition of childhood traumatic experiences that couldn't be talked about, that couldn't be framed. But our psychology and our sociology, which thinks in terms of norms and values, operates at a kind of intellectual level that doesn't touch these deeper structures, which are often shaping male violence. So it's not just male violence as wrong attitudes or beliefs that can be dealt with cognitively in the course. We also have to understand the formative process through which men and women are brought up with images of violence. I'm still haunted by an experience when I was in Mexico in the 1990s at a conference in Puebla. Can everybody understand me talking at this pace? Yeah? It's okay? I went into the church and I witnessed queues of young girls and young boys coming into the church, witnessing these images of suffering. The central image of Catholicism being that of the suffering body of Christ. And these young girls, 5, 6, 7, 8, were witnessing, going round the church, these incredibly traumatic, violent images that they were somehow going to have to carry with themselves as evidence for a sense of Christ who had died for your sins. So there's a way in which the theology, the depth of theology in shaping masculinities and gender relations has not been addressed centrally in the work around men and masculinities that it needs to. We've operated at a psychological level in terms of notions of norms and values and beliefs, or we've organized ourselves through theories, Connell's theories, her theories of hegemonic masculinities, which have talked about relations of power in a kind of theoretical way. Both frame themselves in universal terms. Theories of hegemonic masculinity are universal. The Catholic Church in some way frames itself in universal terms. But I'm more thinking about how these theologies have been formative in the shaping of men's relationship to their bodies and their emotions. And the sense that both across Catholic and Protestant traditions and Jewish traditions, a sense that vulnerability is a sign of weakness and a threat to male identities. So that if men feel vulnerable, often anger becomes the emotion that can turn into violence against women, that becomes the projection of their inability to stay with what's made them vulnerable. It might have been a friend in an accident, it might be an early death, but the inability to speak about these traumatic experiences, which are often framed through religious traditions, has had a deep impact on the shaping of an impersonal relationship to masculinity. So one of the things we found in the 70s and 80s in consciousness raising groups is that men found it very difficult, we found it very difficult to talk in the first person. We were very concerned or found it easier to talk about theoretical discussions around masculinities. And we related to ourselves in rational and somewhat instrumental terms. But when we were asked, no, what does it feel like? What was that experience? could you talk more truthfully about your relationship to your father and what it felt like when you witnessed him hitting your mother? What was that like? What impact did it have? Often the response to men is to cut off from those experiences and to split. So when post-structuralism talks about identities as performative, it's a theory that becomes very attractive for men to use because it allows them to sustain an instrumental relationship to themselves that is often still there in the theorization of men and masculinity, particularly through notions of hegemonic masculinity that give you a universal theorization. But it's also because the theory of hegemonic masculinity in Connell's early work relies upon a distinction between therapeutic and politics. It was partly set up in opposition to Achilles' heel, because in Achilles' heel, we thought that the personal was political, and it was really important to engage the interrelation between the personal and the political. Connell's work, which sidelined Achilles' heel for a long time, said that no, the therapeutic is merely subjective and personal. But for masculinity theory to develop, it had to develop within the political realm of politics. So the notion of the political was set up in radical opposition to the personal and in blind opposition to the understanding of what it means to say that the personal is political. It became the idea, echoed in structural but also in post-structuralist theory, that the personal had to be explained through the structural. The personal experience had to be explained and explained away. And then the notion of truth within post-structuralist traditions became problematic. Truth became an effective discourse. It became a discursive practice. And because truth became unspeakable at some level, because it was a social and historical construction, so did notions of selfhood or the self. The notion of the self became framed as an essentialist conception that was fixed, so that it was as if there was no space for non-binary, LGBT and trans identities, as long as you frame some notion of the personal, rather than thinking that LGBT and trans identities as themselves were expressions of a certain freedom that was gained for people to be themselves. So there is a particular difficulty within a secularized Catholic legacy that was formative for an intellectual generation of professors and administrators who then felt they had an intellectual commitment to feminism as an inequality, along with racial inequality and sexual inequality, but they didn't understand that they didn't understand. They felt comfortable in treating ethics as yet another discursive practice and assuring that truth was an effect of discourse. Out of touch with their own truths, they never really engage with their own formation in practices of consciousness raising. They thought of gender simply to do with women and supporting women. They didn't want to take the risk, these professors and administrators, of really engaging in a practice of consciousness raising themselves. They didn't want to do their own emotional work. And often in Mexico, there were very high levels of affairs in heterosexual relationships where men were carrying on with 2 or 3 other relationships, but it was all seen as matters of private life. So there was a split between the intellectual and the university as a space of academic research, and people's private lives and private relationships that a hegemonic and a post-structuralist theory allowed people to keep back. And then the insights of the 70s feminist work, which were much more radical, were sidestepped as theoretically unrigorous because based on notions of selfhood or notions of the personal. So the first step is to acknowledge, as we had to do when we first in Achilles' heel got together in men's groups, that we didn't understand, but we didn't want to pretend any longer that we did understand. Am I going at a pace now that people can follow? Is this? So I'm partly drawing on notes, but partly allowing myself to be excited by the ideas that emerge and that are shaping through these conversations. The later Foucault, in engaging, felt he had to leave France, like I might have to leave. I had to leave England and to come to Mexico to understand certain things about myself. Foucault went to San Francisco because he wanted to recover some notion of truth-telling. And in Greek, in the Greek rhetoric that he was talking about, this was called parousia. This is something he wanted to show a generation that he had misled in his early work on sexuality. Some ways in that he had taught that truth was discursive. But in his later text called Fearless Speech, possibly talking to heterosexual men in their 40s and 50s now, and so in positions of authority within hierarchies of business and universities. So I'm saying this specifically to that generation who might need to listen to Foucault. I've drawn on intellectual references because if I did this through my own personal experience, they'd probably ignore it. So Foucault says parousia is a kind of frankness, a certain relationship, and he uses the masculine terms, to his own life through danger. So it's talking to that generation of male professors and administrators. So the notion of frankness I liked. I'm not sure what it is in Spanish, to be frank. A certain relationship to your own life through danger. I'm going to tell you a truth that I've hidden, and I've even hidden from myself. A verbal activity in which a speaker expresses, and again using particularly the masculine form, his personal relationship to truth and risks his life, certainly his reputation, because he recognizes truth-telling as a duty to improve or help other people as well as himself. So Foucault here in the later work is regarding the importance and difficulty of truth-telling, how hard it is. So if we stop this session and people just met in small groups of 4 or 5, which we could have thought about, and said something or shared their experience of violence in their own families in the first person, that would be a really interesting practice to develop. To speak, to truth speak. And why has the notion of truth-telling become so difficult? Within a Catholic tradition, it remains in contrast to notions of confession. So there's a tradition of truth-speaking as confession, but confession is a matter of listing sins that are already pre-given. Foucault's notion of a parousia of truth-telling is a risk-taking that was a feature of feminist consciousness raising that men learnt about. So I'm now going to say something which I've learned from Mexico just in the last couple of days, but I think this is relevant. But it's something that might be so familiar to people that you certainly don't want to hear it from a kind of English side. But I think there's something that's important. Within traumatic experiences about how men learn to relate to their bodies, there's often a disdain for the feminine because the feminine comes to be identified with emotions. So not only is gender seen as a women's concern, gender is seen as a women's concern, but many men see emotions as, in some way, as feminine, and therefore as a threat to notions of male purity. So there's a paradox, a contradiction between the notion of the Virgin Mary as untouched by sins of the flesh and the notion of female purity. And then there's the notion of the female as a threat to male reason and male purity, such that women have to be silenced through violence because women at the same time reflect or identified with desire and sexual desire. So men are caught within this paradox of not knowing. So in this way, women deserve violence. It's something that a punishment that they receive that they only have themselves to blame for. So in English culture, it was often said in the 1950s and 60s even, that she got the back of my hand because she was being irrational or unreasonable. So I had to bring her to her senses. So there are all these levels of masculine formation that are disavowed and not explored in most courses, and hopefully they will be in the Mexican course. But at that level, the theoretical framing takes over, and men have done very little work and then feel surprised when either they're not received by the feminist movement very eagerly, or they don't really understand the depths of male anger and violence towards women. We can recall how thousands of women in Mexico, and this is reacted on outrage on social media after the Office of the Public Prosecutor tweeted that the lifestyle of Leslie Berlin-Osorio, 22, and this must be familiar territory, who had been strangled on the Wednesday night with a telephone cord on the UNAM campus. Rather than focusing upon the actions of the killer, the office that would be responsible for investigating her murder turned the attention on Miss Osorio herself, alleging drinking, low attendance record at university, how many of us would be judged for that, and her decision to live with her boyfriend, implying that she had questionable morals. So I want to show how this notion of morality and morals is still playing its part in the legal political system, is structured into the discourses that lawyers are using, and become, if untheorized or unresearched, because they're seen as somehow religious. Or so the way that morality operates within Mexican culture as a Catholic culture is quite different from the UK, which is a Protestant culture. There are structures of power and violence in both that need to be explored, but a universal notion of hegemonic masculinity won't get it. A tweet said she was an alcoholic and a bad student, and another said she'd been taking drugs with friends. This was reported on the BBC News. At some level, as the young acknowledges as a form, and this is what I want to introduce, of epistemic violence. It was epistemic violence used by the prosecutor, who didn't understand that he didn't understand what the reality of the violence, the murderous violence that this young woman was exposed to. The depth of patriarchal assumptions that can at some level coalesce with an uneasy commitment to gender equality. That same office of the public prosecutor at the same time was probably committed to some notion of gender equality. Where this has been interpreted as a new move towards equal opportunities for women on the labour market. Tweeting resistance from women and men across Mexico almost 50,000 times with the hashtag Si me matin, if I die, people speculated how their personal lives would be used against them if they were murdered. If they kill me, they will say I lived alone in Mexico City. They will say I was a feminist. They will invent everything to make me responsible for my murder. If they kill me, I want them to shout loudly, like I will tomorrow for Lesbi, wrote Julia Lazos, a student at UNAM, where the murder had taken place. Laura Castellanos, a freelance reporter, texted, Si me matin, it will be for being a Mexican journalist, for going where I should not go, for describing massacres and corruption, for refusing to be silent. In another popular tweet, Paulo Villarreal, a computer scientist, said, I hope the police and media focus on my killer, not on my clothes, studies, work, and who I go to bed with. I'm saying this or drawing on these painful events to show a methodology which brings in different voices. It's a psychosocial formative sociology, which is ethnographic in wanting the theoretical discussion not to be separated from women's voices speaking out against violence. It wants the theoretical concepts not to be delivered in a theory of hegemonic masculinity, but through the very different masculinities that are being brought into work in these particular situations. A blogger, Ana Gonzalez, asks, do you know what's the worst thing about the hashtag Si me matin? I probably say that badly. Behind every tweet is a woman terrified because she knows that they could kill her. Framing a vision of the ethical human, someone else under the hashtag Seth Bingo advised, pay attention to Si me matin, because if you're a woman and you're killed, before they investigate, they will find information to invalidate you as a human being. I was struck by that notion, invalidate you as a human being, that goes across gender and sexual boundaries as ethical humans. In this new work that I'm after transforming masculinities, I've done a book that's going to come out in Routledge in November, which is about ethical humans and whether that's a way in which to open up a discussion across sexual and gender differences. So that event was in some way what provoked a lot of the demonstrations that have happened and are still happening, and the closure of the philosophy and letters faculty that we're thinking in the middle of. But I also want to just say something about the authorities' response to the protests, if I'm not overstepping my mark. And I want to say that in terms of exploring the particular masculinity of the president, Obrador, and how to understand his response to gender violence in terms of a particular masculinity that he expresses, which at some level is a Catholic masculinity, Catholic left masculinity of a certain sort that needs analysing, that basically says that women's place is almost within the domestic sphere. President Obrador insisted after the strike on November the 4th, the women's strike, we are living in times of liberty, justice, tolerance, and the search for peace. So he's contrasting this with the 1968 massacres in the university, that some of us still remember the images of those massacres. We are living in times of liberty, justice, tolerance, and the search for peace. These are new times because there is no authoritarianism, no corruption. So one of the things is to explore and investigate that form of masculinity and how it makes it hard for the authorities, or easier for the authorities, not to respond to the demands made by students. So if it's not a time of dictatorial rule, the everyday violence and abuse that women in Mexico have been suffering for so long, the femicides and the increasing numbers of femicides, show that his description that we are living in times of liberty, justice, tolerance, and the search for peace somehow already excludes women's experience, or lesbian and gay experience in relationship to the violence that's happening in Mexico. In 2019, 1,006 of 3,825 murders were officially classified as femicides, women or girls killed because of their gender. That compared with 426 in 2015, when the authorities began counting such crimes. The president seems to distance himself from the femicide crisis, blaming it on the neoliberal policies of previous governments. So one of the things the course needs to explore is, what do we mean by neoliberal masculinities, and in what way does he present a different kind of masculinity? He has slashed fundings for programs created to support women, including daycare and shelters. As David Agron has reported, violence against women has surged in Mexico since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, but the country's president has downplayed the problem and slashed the budgets of agencies charged with addressing women's issues. Elmo, as the president is known, reflects a particular leftist masculinity that needs to be deconstructed. He has claimed that 90% of calls to emergency services over domestic violence were false, and insists to journalists Mexican women have never been as protected as now. His declarations reflect a perpetuation of the impunity that has existed in Mexico, says Wendy Figueroa, director of the National Network of Shelters. What's also serious...
3 minutes, Victor.
Great. What's also serious is that he's doubting the word of women in situations of violence.
Mm-hmm.
So my last 3 minutes, I'm going to say something about engaging men and masculinities. This is the kind of another framing. As young men feel horror at these stories and want to do something about it, they can find themselves trapped in their own masculinities that they've learnt to assume they could guide their lives by reason alone. But as Maya Angelou, the African-American writer and activist, has noted, a bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. Even though this was a saying printed on a US stamp, I'm not sure whether people understood it as a challenge to a particular dominant neoliberal masculinity that feels that it constantly has to have an answer to any problem that it confronts. Often men's response to women's pain, anger, sadness, depression, is somehow to think that it's up to men to provide a solution rather than simply to deeply listen to the distress. That's partly because men haven't engaged with their own distress, that they find it hard to listen. They don't know how to listen deeply. And often their failure to listen deeply can lead or foster a certain kind of violent or controlling response because they don't want to hear the pain. But on the other hand, and this is something I want to end with, the theory of hegemonic masculinity has tended to frame a theory that men as the source of power have everything that they could want. And it frames a kind of radical feminist notion which hasn't helped us educate a younger generation of men who've often been left simply feeling guilty for the oppression and suffering of women. It's meant that a theory of hegemonic masculinity, which was really important in its time, didn't serve us in order to be able to educate future younger generations of men. It simply reproduced a sense of guilt and an uneasy relationship to their own experiences. What this has meant is that men's witnessing, going back to this scene that we've all shared, and it was certainly that of in my family, though it was my mother's violent anger at my stepfather that was so hard to witness, and possibly why I've worked on this work for so long. But often the traumatic childhood experiences and also sexual abuse that boys have experienced has taken in Britain 20 years for for footballers in their 40s and 50s. And I say this because I know Mexico's really into football. For them to come out and realize how they were raped, sexually abused by their coaches. They were so shamed by the experience, and their football coaches had told them that nobody would believe them. So they carried that pain for 40 years. This has happened in the Catholic Church across the world. We have reports of sexual abuse where the authorities have sought to defend the reputation of the church rather than the sufferings of the children. So we need a theory of masculinity, and I'm really strong on this, that engages men's suffering and pain and gives voice to the traumatic experiences that men have lived through as part of a revisioning of an ethical human that can engage with the traumatic histories that men themselves have also suffered without denying the overwhelming realities of violence against women and sexual violence that I've also illuminated, and also the epistemic violence that the authorities have actually used, and the need to investigate this. So the course could also do research while it does the learning into exactly these kinds of issues, but only if men are prepared to share their own experiences, painful and traumatic, often histories in their own families, do we find that there is a commitment to truth-telling, to speaking the truth, not as something that you can easily do out of will, but as something that you will learn to write your own history. One of the posters that Benno sent me of the struggles in UNAM has insisted, la historia también la hacemos y escribimos nosotros. We make history too, and we also write our own herstories. Men have written histories for too long in their own terms, but often even in our own personal histories, there's been so much false news and so much evasion and so much fear of talking more truthfully to our partners, both in heterosexual relationships and in gay and queer relationships. So on that note, thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Victor. A pleasure, a challenge to hear you, to listen to you. Gloria, te cedo la palabra.
Gloria, please take the floor. Thank you very much, Victor, for this quite lengthy trip on the very different visions of the participation that men have in these processes. First of all, I would like to say that sexuality that you mentioned there is still a quite problematic issue. For most people in our Western culture, we still have a heterosexist vision of sexuality focused in reproduction. And I believe that even though we could all agree on that specific criticism, there is not a lot of work that I can see to change this reproductive heterosexist view of sexuality. Even though many of us have mentioned it, there is no real work around the specific issue that breaks this concept and that places a lot of people in a vulnerable position, specifically women, to face sexual violence that we see daily. Feminists from the 80s and the 70s defended quite stringently the idea of emphasizing sexuality of women, but it seems to me that in this fight of equality in public spaces, it privileged the public life, which is what you were saying. How is it that public life became more prevalent even for the feminist movement, leaving aside the intimate life and subjectivity of people? And we are currently looking for the participation of men. We don't have a lot of tools to help them, even from feminism, because this type of work has been left out in a way. So the participation of men in masculinities is an initiative that is extremely important. For this university, is quite critical. specifically when we see that public policies that have been instrumented from the 90s or that have fostered the participation of women in practically all spaces and areas of life, we should not just consider that the participation or not considering the participation of men in this specific effort is a type of work that is missing a limb, that is not considering all of the integral parts of the process. So we need to acknowledge that in the work towards equality, we have found a lot of shortcomings. However, we need to acknowledge that there are several voids here, voids that need to be addressed. Sexuality and gender from a comprehensive vision, a different vision that is not only women, that is not only reproduction. Okay, so the main objective of feminism is social transformation, which implies everyone, includes everyone. So gender equality demands us to consider the wide diversity of areas. And as Victor has also mentioned, the importance of intersectionality here, especially in a society like ours, a multicultural society, where to understand society as a whole is a big challenge. And sometimes we touch upon certain specific issues, disability or Afro-descendants or indigenous peoples, but we are not having the full picture yet, this multicultural comprehensive view that includes and encompasses everyone. That is a challenge. And the challenge is really major when we look at it fully. When we try to understand what is Mexican society, how do we really get into these challenges of transformation of a society that is inherently discriminatory, which is what we are. So from this point, I take this idea of not understanding that we don't understand, because this necessarily implies an ethical position of questioning our own selves, but questioning ourselves in relation with authority or in relation with the other. What is our position towards the other? How do we relate to the other? That is to say, we need to leave the comfortable center, and we need to start reviewing our own personality to fully understand how we have been contributing to the maintenance of this type of inequality, because we are part of the system. We are part of the society. And when we consider that this is not our competence or that we have grown beyond the system, the thing is that we are not really facing the uncomfortable nature of what this really creates, because this critical review forces us to understand this as a lifestyle. It's not a fact that today I understand, I take some actions, and now I'm on the other side. No, this is a lifestyle of constant review, because we are part of this discriminatory, unequal system. And without realizing, we trip with the same stone, as we say. Every time we try to consider that we are beyond the system that we live in. As Victor has said, this condition is necessarily part of our story, our history, and it is manifested in many different ways in our daily life, in a brutal way or in a subtle way, but it's there and clearly differentiated by gender, how we experience violence, how we reproduce violence, men and women, is different. How do we face violence? The various expressions of gender, that is also different. So what you're saying, Victor, right here, I need to say it is very, very important. We need to place ourselves and trying to understand what is our place, what has been our place in this unequal system. And for many men, the analysis of their reality is quite shocking, as if their own life story is not subject to review or criticism. However, for so many, it has been a more frequent practice. Specifically, in very recent years, I can see more men that are actually questioning themselves and that are coming into this space, for example, more voluntarily, starting with paternity, for example, or fatherhood. I remember 10 years ago, more or less, when men started appearing on the streets carrying the diaper bag of their kids, which was unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago. Picking up kids from their school, from their kindergarten, to see them on the parks, to see them in plazas or malls pushing a stroller or playing with their kids. This was never part of men's life. And that is how I see fatherhood as a super important vehicle for the development of affection of men. So fatherhood has been such an important vehicle for men to dare to kiss their own kids, to kiss other people, because these expressions or these behaviors were forbidden for men before. So that's where I see not necessarily decided action on men that I am going to change as of now. Perhaps necessity itself forced or pushed men to fatherhood activities. And I don't know if there have been some studies perhaps that have allowed us to understand what is the meaning of all of that. What does that mean for men that are currently in charge of their children, that are taking on that responsibility, even in couples that have been divorced, for example, or are separated, that are currently educating and raising their kids in this way. So I believe that there is a very interesting point that we have not perhaps studied so in depth that allow us to see these aspects. Also, the relationship of men with women. What is the relationship that men currently have with women? And not only with their partner. This is also a challenge that a lot of people have tried to solve and to try to get along with women, and some others also have this. So I don't think many have an easy relationship, because also women demand for men to behave and start from our experience, and I don't think that is possible. So that's where I understand that everyone has to do their own work, because we come from a gender system that is very, very differentiated, very different. So each of us have to do their own work, but together. That is where I have a lot of questions. How do we do this? How do we do to search the transformation together, men and women? It's not that men should look for a transformation and women should look for another transformation. Experience had showed us that that doesn't lead to equality, and that quite easily, if we do that, we start reproducing elements that are not fruitful. So this, of course, needs to lead us to read and analyze and study authors that have mentioned here, because the way of equality is not only our own experience. We need to understand, we need to study and critically analyze all of these issues. So perhaps many of you will try to replicate the feminist groups that have been working for many years. But it has to be clear that these groups never sought to the feminization of their groups. The aim of these groups is to understand their place in the world for its transformation. Precisely what it was called the displacement, to displace ourselves from where we currently are. So the search for equality demands us to read this reality, these messages that Victor was reading today for us, these testimonies that he was referencing, are a confrontation to go beyond the text, to read between the lines, and to see the role of men and authors are not saying in those texts. So when women present this type of testimonies, we need to ask, what is the role of men? Where are they in these testimonies? Why are women saying this? Right? So this is exactly what we need to study. It's not only about supporting or respecting women. We need to just go a little beyond and understand. So I really, really appreciate so many people joining today's session. And I fully believe that more men will join this type of ideas. And thank you very much, Victor, for these ideas that you have placed on the table to understand new realities. I believe that what Victor has said allowed us to more deeply reflect on the challenges that we currently have if we want to break away from this inertia that has allowed us to think that we are moving towards a social transformation when we really do have very big obstacles with religion, tradition, values that does not allow us to break away from those shackles where we have established certain ideas for one or others. Thank you very much. And I hope that we can continue conversing on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I think this has been a great compliment to what Victor has said, and that lands on the context of the gender crisis we have in Mexico. This made me think from other times I've listened to you and listened to Victor well. And before we go on to our Q&A session, Victor manages to, from abroad, work with men in a sensitive and participatory way. And it also comes to my mind what our colleagues in Argentina, the way they're talking about uncomfortable masculinity, or the masculinity made uncomfortable, or what Gloria just said, to shake masculinity and to move on to different ways of creating subjectivity. And this is not a part of the diploma course, but part of the process. Victor said it could be interesting to just stop, split the group into 5, and start talking about the truth. And Victor, I still remember when in the Colegio de Mexico, at that big hall, you stopped your speech before, after talking of Pablo Freire, and you said, just talk to your neighbor. What has my father given onto me? What have I inherited from my father? What am I bearing or dragging around that belongs to my father? And that is part of the perspective we have in this diploma, in this workshop, that is talking about your own experiences before going on to the theory. And well, we have 10 minutes left. There are two questions, one from Jaque Flores. How is drug consumption and alcohol consumption linked to gender violence and the construction of hegemonic masculinities? Karen Silvestre asks, as a woman, how can I help, how can I support, accompany men to connect with themselves and their emotions or painful experiences? I'm telling you, we have 70 people on Zoom, 120 people are on Facebook Live, and 15 people on YouTube. Yabra Hernandez, what a nice comment. As a trans man, I have realized that the same transsexual community, especially that of trans men, there is this rejection of the feminine, not only in terms of the body, but also in terms of the emotions that have been wrongly associated only to women. The masculinities of trans men also have to be deconstructed, and the heteronorm is also reaching us. Karen Silvestre says she's a student of psychology and that she has realized that currently men have tried to reply the feminist narrative and they have knowledge of the concepts, but it remains a narrative. You do not really see it in their actions, and the customs of Mexican culture are perpetuated and linger on. Excellent conference. It is interesting to see how many women are reacting. Deborah Poe, in Mexico, there are many families who are fighting for the femicides of their daughters to be investigated as such, because in the past they were not classified as such, in spite of the fact that the category and the typification of the crime was in the Constitution. Someone from Querétaro says, I love the fact of speaking from me as an I and leave the collective, the us, because that serves as an armor, not to take any responsibility for my own pain. Byron Antonio from Nicaragua, greetings to Nicaragua. And he says, I am very interested in all the topics and all the issues you have raised. And some other comments. The fathers who carry out the activities Gloria mentioned are seen as heroes, whereas these are only normal activities of raising children. Karen says, of course, this has been the insistence of mothers and a change in attitude of men, but men still struggle to respect women. Society allows many things, and they are struggling to understand. Clara Lopez says, what role does globalization have in this process of masculinities? And I would like to close with Mariana Osorio. Please note that only one man has participated in social media, and we will also have a participation of the people who are in this workshop. For researchers who study masculinities, what is the best tip or the best piece of advice you can give us in order to work with our men? Because we see that there is a barrier that prevents men from disclosing their painful experiences when interviewed by women. We have just a few minutes, and I would like Victor to maybe revisit all the comments we have just mentioned with closing remarks, and then we'll move on to Gloria. Thank you. Victor, please go ahead.
It's hard to respond to some of the questions. Yes. I'm just thinking about issues both in relationship to how masculinity has been shaped through neoliberal times and globalization, and the need to trace differences between different generations and certain intensifications of masculinity that have been a feature of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism has intensified a kind of competitive male culture and produced certain fears of failure, of having no value. So there's an intensification of masculinity within neoliberal intensities that means that men are in fear of kind of letting down their public appearance and draw a stronger distinction between public and private life than they might have done in an earlier period. So there's a kind of redescription of the distinction between public and private life. And that distinction is particularly strong and intense in Mexico. So some of the research has shown that there's quite a lot of domestic violence in the context of the home and within the domestic sphere, but in public, people act very differently. So the distinction framed in different ways through neoliberalism between public and private, and then the particular experience in Mexico of what it means to privatize. So we can't assume that that's the same. That's part of the importance of the exploration that you can do, that you have a sense of how that distinction between public and private life has, say, changed between your older sister, your older brother's period, and how that's led to a particular kind of tension. So I'm interested in how the idealization, and I relate this to Catholicism in a certain kind, the idealization becomes the real, like in Benno's example. So in my relationship, how I frame relationships to women, there's an idealization of how they should be treated, which is in sharp contrast to the silences about how they are actually treated in the relationships of the family. So there's really important investigations and research to be done about the very different framing between public and private spheres in different class framings in Mexico and also in questions of race. So one of the features is, over the last few years, is both the notion of a racialized capitalism. So how questions of race through neoliberalism are framing a different conception of race and how racial divisions are there in the structuring of hierarchies within capitalism. And then the particular shaping that takes in cultures which deny the existence of racial difference and say we're all mixed. So by saying we're all mixed and that race therefore doesn't exist, it renders people being invisible, or racial differences are just not seen in a particular kind of way. So you can just be in a restaurant in Mexico and then see who's serving or the levels of whiteness and just observe or think about how questions of race and gender over the last 10 or 15 years need to be rethought in quite fundamental ways. So people are positioned because of the existence of everyday and structural racism. So the impact of the George Floyd murders in the States and the global movement for Black Lives Matter and how that resonated in Mexico or didn't resonate in Mexico around questions of Afro-Mexicans. Was it the same as Afro-Brazilians, where issues, if it wasn't the same as Afro-Brazilian, what is the difference between Brazil and Mexico? So again, the thing is, by focusing on the particular cultures and histories, you get a much richer understanding of masculinities than if you have a top-down theory or the idea that we've got to have the correct theory before we can actually then develop the ethnographic or the empirical work. So that was one. And then thinking through some of the glorious responses, which are really challenging and interesting, the way in which sexuality is a hard area in people's lives. and hard to speak about, particularly within particular cultural framings and for particular generations. So sexual histories are different across different generations, particularly those who've grown up in more socially liberal sexual cultures with non-binary identities and subjectivities being possible. So I think that's the difficulties of talking about sexuality within different cultures, or the mediated ways in which sexuality is referred to, is represented in very different kinds of language between public and private language. How do people talk in public? How do people talk in private? Is there in Mexico a way of investigating different linguistic practices of performance and presentation in public, which also shapes academic life in a particular kind of way? How's that? And then also Gloria raised questions of intersectionality. So you wonder how questions of intersectionality that are worked out in relationship to the experience of African American women and the way in which the experience of African American women was discounted because they were either treated in terms of Black America or they were treated in terms of gender, but their particular experience got lost. So that's why the theory of intersectionality was really important. But how does that fit within the Mexican framework? So if you universalize it too quickly, you lose the way in which that language or the narrative of intersectionality was framed in terms of the particular gendered experience in the US, which relates to race and particular histories of slavery. That's different in Mexico in relationship to indigenous populations and how do indigenous populations challenge certain notions of hegemonic masculinity. So that was and then possibly one other response was, which I was interested in, this question of fathering and paternity. How does fathering and paternity, how's that changed over the last 20 or 30 years? So what work has been done in the through Mexican and Latin American researchers on changes in the last 20 or 30 years in the position of fathers and the involvement of fathers with their children, and how has that changed the gender relations, also relating to what Gloria was saying about relationships between men and women in the context of families, both in gay and straight families, how we theorize and understand those relationships and the formation of very different kinds of families. I think these are all really important questions, and they take us back to the course, and the course thinking about what the issues are that people bring into the course themselves and need to kind of explore and investigate. I think being a father and notions of patriarchy and fatherhood and how fatherhood has a particular significance needs to be thought out. And also, particularly in terms of decolonizing, there's no point having a universal theory of masculinity, which basically then treats traditional or indigenous masculinities simply in their relationship of power to hegemonic masculinities. It just doesn't help at all.
Thank you very much. Gloria, un breve comentario, reacción.
Thank you very much. Gloria, do you have any comment, anything to add? Well, I definitely didn't want to applaud paternity. I only see it as a dimension for analyzing transforming masculinity, which is a very important one. I think that that takes us to have a look, what does this mean for new generations? What is paternity? Paternity, for me, has a very important role in this transformation process we are in. But one thing I would like to take from what Victor said and what he already expressed again was what happens with our identities. We are all very proud of our origins, our pre-Hispanic indigenous origins, and all this folklore we have built around it. And I don't want to go to the extreme to say that in Mexico, most people consider themselves white. I do not doubt there are people who don't, but I mean, what Victor says, the fact of saying, I'm not white, I am a mestizo. When you say mestizo, what roots are you acknowledging by saying you're mestizo? Or is being mestizo a hindrance to have a look at who we are? When I say I am mestizo, am I acknowledging the Afro origin of my mother and the indigenous origin of my mother? Or what does it mean to be mestizo? Because what I see is that in Mexico, we are very Americanized, North Americanized. And I want to say it in a very peaceful way, in that we are in the North, we are geographically in the North, and it looks like our look is always pointing at Europe, Canada, the US. And that has to do with an academic culture, a very strong one as well. I acknowledge myself as a Latin Americanist, and at least 60% of the literature I use in my courses is Latin American. Because I think that the fact that we do not read authors, both men and women, in our professional training leaves us with an enormous gap and also a distorted vision of the theoretical construction and the critical analysis we can carry out. And this is brutal. So I think in that sense, it is important to acknowledge this multicultural identity is very important. Also, in this process, if we're talking about identity, well, this relates to the hegemonic, both masculine and feminine models that we are reproducing. And how, in that system, we are sustaining the discrimination of our own identities, or very important dimensions of our own identities. And I ask myself, how is that hindering us real criticism on what we are in order to decentralize, to create a shift, to unroot ourselves and to see, okay, what are we? And to move out of this allegedly privileged position we are in. So I think this is a very important aspect. And as regards one of the questions that were asked in the chat on violence and the feelings men face, I think literature in terms of victim shaming is very important, is paramount, because women have fought a lot not to be victim shamed. And what we have lived shouldn't put us in a vulnerable situation or a situation of fragility, but rather give us tools to acknowledge, to see what we're going through, but also come out of that situation. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Gloria. This is an invitation to shake and unroot ourselves, not only in terms of masculinity, but also our class perception, our ethnicity, our racial perception, our gender, the place we have in the course of life. So I would like to give a hand to Victor and Gloria. I would like to thank the presence of our students, the people who are following us on Facebook. We still have some comments from Charlie, Alejandro, Claudia, which we were not able to share, and the support of the Directorate for Inclusive Practices, and also the Culture and Communications Division of the university. So please do not leave. We're going to entertain a small dialogue together with Victor Seidler and Gloria, but we are going to stop our transmission as of now. Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you very much to the interpreters for their work.